Hi, it's Brent Bozell, and I'm very pleased today to have with me Congressman Bob Good, who represents the 5th District of Virginia. He was elected in 2021, and he's had a very quick rise to becoming the head of the House Freedom Caucus, and has been quite outspoken on a number of issues. And I want to bring them up with him today because they're all timely, and they're two sides of the divide on most of them, even within conservative circles. So we're going to let the congressman say his piece and explain why he believes the things he believes in. The first question I want to ask you, and to thank you first for joining us today.
Brent, great to be with you.
There's an issue that you've taken the lead on, which is near and dear to the Media Research Center, because we've looked at this for years, and thank goodness that finally it's being addressed by you. Tell me what you are doing with National Public, with NPR, with National Public Radio, and why finally is there a move to privatize this dinosaur of a corporation?
It's amazing, Brent, after all these years that we're still talking about this. And I know you understand this issue better than anybody. But 35 years ago, as a college student, a young professional, I can remember listening to All Things Considered and Morning Edition, Daniel Schorr and Cokie Roberts and Nina Totenberg and those folks. And I knew it was left-leaning. I knew it provided the left perspective, but I thought they tried to be somewhat fair and somewhat, allow dissenting views and so forth. But that was also back in the time when the left defended the right to free speech vociferously. That was back when the left media perceived an important role of holding government accountable as the responsibility of the media. That's long since gone by many in the media. And so the fact that we are here decades later still funding to the tune of roughly $100 million a year any media entity, let alone one that is so far left and offends half of the country with their presentation of the so-called news or their analysis of the news. And so it's high time that we defund them. And I hope that all Republicans will join me in supporting that.
You're well put. Daniel Schorr, Nina Totenberg, et al., they're all liberals, but they all came from what they believed was a perspective of moderation. And they all purported to believe in objectivity, which, by the way, doesn't exist. But you can strive for objectivity as a holy grail. They erred, and they were to the left of the center. However, the huge difference between them, as you say, and today is they make no bones about it. NPR is far left, and they start from that perspective, and the hell with anybody else who doesn't look at that, which is perfectly fine if they were their own company. But if they were, look, I make this point, Bob, you've had over the years, you've had one attempt after another to launch left-wing for-profit companies, media companies, to compete with Rush Limbaugh, to compete with Sean Hannity, Mark Levin. Every single one failed. There's a great thing called the market, and you either do or you don't connect. And the far left doesn't. That's why they've got NPR, because they need $100 million. But here's another point. If you look at National Public Radio, the way I look at it, Bob, is you only need one station if it's National Public Radio. You only need one. If you go, I have no idea how many affiliates NPR has. It's hundreds. Every college has one. Every city has 2 or 3 or 4. There's no need for this, but these are all make-work companies. You could get rid of $100 million and we'd never miss it. And that's just radio. Once you get to television, with public broadcasting television, that was set up because there was a felt need for cultural programming when you had 3 networks. And this was 64, whenever it was. Today, you've got hundreds of networks. There's absolutely no reason for it because the market has filled this to overflowing over the air, not to mention streaming media now. So there's no need for it. So you look at this thing, and the whole thing has to go. So anyway, thank you for that. What are your priorities as head of the House Freedom Caucus? If you could snap a whip, what would happen?
Well, I would say three things that I'm particularly focused on. And of course, there's many existential threats to the country. There's many issues that are sort of getting the short shrift, if you will. But I predominantly focus on three things: securing the border. And we have failed miserably as Republicans to do that. As you know, we've continued to fund the government that's perpetrating the border invasion. We've continued to fund the very things we campaign against. And we failed, as you know, to connect border security to Ukraine funding, something the Democrats were very desperate for. And so we could have used that as leverage. And we promised to do that and then did not do that. So border security, I think the president's done irreparable harm. I think you can argue that this is the most intentional harm a U.S. president's ever done to the United States, is what the president's done with the border. It's unconscionable, and we could go on about that for hours. Secondly, the debt, the spending that's crushing us, causing 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates. Credit's been downgraded. The American people are suffering. We're paying about $1 trillion in interest on the debt now. We're adding $1 trillion in debt about every 100 days after it took some 200 years to get to the first trillion. We Republicans can't just talk about it. We've actually got to be willing to do it, and we have failed to do that, quite frankly. But the third area, again, border, our debt, and our spending. And the third one would be protecting constitutional liberties. That has got to be paramount. And we're seeing those trampled upon us today in ways that would have been unimaginable even 5 years ago, Brent. Things that happened during the pandemic, things that have happened with the censorship through big tech and the collusion between the White House and the media to do that, or certainly the big tech type media. The weaponization of the government, two-tier justice system, and those kinds of things. The FISA reform, where we failed to put a warrant requirement in there when we reauthorized FISA. And again, these are failures when Republicans have had control of at least the House, where we ought to be willing to really fight with the Senate rather than join hands with the Senate and do what the Senate has agreed to do. So those are three areas that I'm particularly focused on, and I'm eager to get Senate control and to get the White House back. But then we'll have no more excuses if we keep the House majority. We can't blame the Senate and the White House for failure to deliver to the American people.
What if, Bob, what if those three areas were the alpha and the omega of the House Freedom Caucus? How many Republicans do you think on Capitol Hill right now in the House support those three planks?
In terms of truly being willing to put action behind those beliefs. I often say it doesn't really matter what you believe if you're not willing to fight for what you believe, to stand up and be counted, to take risks, to suffer consequences, trying to fight for those things that are that we claim that we hold dear. So I would say you've got somewhere, you could just look at the votes, Brent, over the last year and a half when we've had majority control, and the number of Republicans who've been willing to take the tough votes have been consistently, I would say, 25 to 75 members, depending on the vote and how tough it is. And at most, we've been in the 150 range. When we've tried to, my House Freedom Caucus colleagues and I put forth literally hundreds of specific, targeted spending cut amendments to the appropriations process, the spending bills last summer, last fall. And the top number was around 150 Republicans who would vote for those. So you had some 70 or so who, because maybe they were afraid of being not being reelected, or maybe they were afraid of their constituents whose ox would be gored by that, maybe their donor base, maybe where the jobs are in their district, I don't know. But you had some 70 or so Republicans, about a third, that just would not vote for spending cuts. And these were egregious things that were indefensible and really not the appropriate role of the federal government, not justified in the Constitution. So I think we're somewhere between a third being generous, that would be courageous to some degree, and maybe 2/3 that if it's not too terribly costly, they want to do it. But I think you've got a full third of the Republican conference that really doesn't want to do the things that we run on and that we talk about.
Bob, it's good that you say that, because I don't know that the public or the conservative base really understands that, because there's an assumption that if you're a Republican, you're a fiscal conservative. Why? Because every single one, every single Republican, every single one runs as a fiscal conservative. Every single one says that that is awful and we have to do something about it. Every single one talks about the border. Every single one talks about what you're talking about. And they raise their billions of dollars collectively, and they get elected or reelected to the House, and then they head for the tall grass. Unless they have to go back on weekends to speak to their constituencies in their town halls, and they're right back to being conservative. Nobody runs as a liberal Republican anymore. And I think, Bob, look, I don't know what you think about this, but when you've got Republicans who are voting on an agenda to the left of Teddy Kennedy, what does that make them? It doesn't make them moderates anymore, and you got to call them out on this, and I'm glad you are. Let's move.
Well, if I may add to that just quickly, that's why they hate the Freedom Caucus so much, because to your point, you hit it spot on, Brent. Almost every Democrat runs as a moderate and then governs like a crazy communist, leftist, Marxist. Republicans are just the opposite, to your point. They all run as conservatives, and then some significant portion go and vote like moderates and then try to go back home and lie to their constituents and their voters on what they voted for or against. But the Freedom Caucus fighters expose that, both by the differentiation between our vote and theirs. And frankly, we name and shame, and we come back and talk about it. And they get very angry at us because we tell their voters how they voted. But, I'm happy to have anyone tell my voters how I voted, because I believe in the things that I'm voting for or against, and I stand behind those votes, and I tell them, I'm just trying to help let your voters know how you vote, and you ought to be proud of that too, or maybe you should vote differently if you're not.
Bob, over in the Senate, look at Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell runs as leader by promising, remember, he was going to get rid of Obamacare root and branch in every single speech that he gave. And he talks about all these things, and he's infamous for saying to anyone who asks him to do something, show me the votes. And if you can't show me a majority vote, never mind, get out of my office. So much for leadership. There was no intention whatsoever on his part to do anything. And that's been the case with past leaders. Okay, so that's going to move us over to Mike Johnson. You and I have a difference of opinion, but not by much. Let me give you, well, first let me ask you your position. Then I'll give you my position, and then ask you to comment on it.
Just on Mike Johnson, broadly, or specific to motion to vacate?
Broadly.
Attach the question as you want me to answer.
Broadly. Which?
Broadly, I think Mike Johnson is a conservative in his heart. I think he believes the right things. I think he wants the right things for the country. But we've hired him to do a job. It's not personal. It's not personality. It's performance-based. And there's no other way to score it than I think he's been an abysmal failure. Because while we do have a tight majority in one house of one branch of government, we ought to at least pass out of the House bills and policies that reflect the Republican majority that the American people gave us. And on every significant vote that we've taken over the last 6 months since he's become Speaker. Now, mind you, we've taken hundreds of insignificant votes, meaning they're messaging bills the Senate doesn't have to and won't take up, because Chuck Schumer has a very different worldview, obviously, than we Republicans in the House. But when there's points of leverage because it's a must-pass bill or it's something the Democrats want, every single one of those we've passed with overwhelmingly 90% plus Democrat votes, which reflect whose priorities? Democrat priorities, and they've split and divided Republicans. That's true of the spending bills and the continuing resolutions, which kept in place. Why wouldn't Democrats vote for them? The Biden, Pelosi, Schumer policies when they had full control of government, and even increased the spending levels over what was in place, again, when they had full control of government. Talk about FISA reform, where we reauthorized FISA without the warrant requirement to protect your and our listeners, our viewers, constitutional liberties and freedoms. Speaker Johnson voted with the folks who voted against a warrant requirement so that the federal government can continue now to spy and surveil and query your data from private entities that you share your data with, or spy on you without a warrant, without your knowledge. You go to the foreign aid package, where the Speaker promised to not give money to Ukraine without border security. And what did he do? We borrowed $95 billion for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and some other things that were thrown in. All of it borrowed. $9.5 billion, which was funding for Hamas in order to buy Democrat votes for the Israeli conflict. And we didn't pay for any of it after we begged him to give us pay-for amendments. He wouldn't do that. We didn't tie border security to it because he wanted it to pass. And then we destroyed the Israel bill by adding the $9.5 billion for Hamas, by the way, which Hamas stole the first delivery of aid this past weekend and killed some citizens who were trying to get to it, the very first delivery package. And so the speaker has continued to fail us. He's let us down. I don't think he has the fight, the courage, the resolve, the leadership skills. At least it hasn't been demonstrated.
Okay. That's pretty clear. Let me give you my position. I take a backseat to no one on condemnations of continuing resolutions. That's a complete abdication of responsibility that kicks the can down the road and puts the bill on my children and my grandchildren. And that's been going on for over 20 years. And it's a disgraceful action on the part of the Congress. I take a backseat to no one on shutting down the government. I participated in, I helped lead it over Obamacare. And I'm happy with that. We did it, and we got very good results out of it for a while anyway, until Mitch McConnell decided he didn't want to fight for it anymore. So I'm not a wimp when it comes to this. So what's my difference of opinion on this? I agree with every single policy description except for one, which we'll get into in a minute. But everything else I agree with you completely on. My concern was that the Republican Party was not prepared to make its case to the American people on the shutdown, on a shutdown over things like border security. Even though it's massively supported, it wasn't prepared to do it with a one-vote majority and with the clock ticking. That said, though I bit my bottom lip till blood came out, that said, I also believe that at this point, he needs to pick a fight with the Democrats, which I think is border security, to show that the Republicans mean business, but also to make sure that Republicans pick up seats, because guaranteed, if he doesn't, y'all are going to lose the majority in November. Of course, there won't be a debate over Mike Johnson being Speaker because he won't be Speaker. I told Kevin McCarthy this on the eve of the 2018 elections. The moment I endorsed Jim Jordan for Speaker, he wanted to meet with me. And we sat in his gilded office, and he told me about all these wonderful things he was going to do. The biggest pile of BS you ever heard, meaning absolute. I mean, Bob, every single thing he talked about was just so small ball. I didn't know what he was talking about. And at the end of it, I said, whatever happened to Obamacare? What happened to reducing the debt? Whatever happened to cutting taxes? All these things you promised to do. Again, it was kicking the ball down the road. And I told him the only thing he should worry about is measuring the drapes on the minority leader's office, because there was nothing he could do. I think the same thing will happen to the Republicans if there isn't a fight. And it's not bad to lose a fight either. Ronald Reagan lost battle after battle before winning a war, because the problem Republicans have is that the base doesn't believe them. It just doesn't believe that there's going to be a fight. You talk to people out there, and it's a pox on both your houses. This is why Donald Trump is running as well as he's running. This is why he won in 2016, because he ran against both parties on Capitol Hill as do-nothing parties, except Democrats do things. So I think that he needs to pick a fight. Now, what fight, as a hypothetical, between now and the election, if Mike Johnson were to lead, would make you change your mind?
Well, to your point, I want to comment. You're exactly right. We begged and pled with the Speaker over the last 6 months to fight for something. Hey, we may lose the fight, but we'll lose every fight we don't get into. And what we've been doing is we're figuring out, okay, what will Schumer take? What will the Senate pass? What will the president sign? Because we cannot risk shutting down the government or any consequence. And once you let the Democrats know that you will not shut down the government. They know they have all of the power and all of the leverage. And so we find ourselves, we just ask the Dems, will they agree to this? We tell the Democrats we'd like to do that. And they just go, no, we're not going to do that. Well, we can't shut down the government. I guess we got to agree to what the Democrats want to do. And the problem with the premise of your question to some degree, Brent, is we've given up all the leverage. There's virtually no more must pass or leverage points where we can force the Democrats to do something. We could have, and we begged the Speaker, let's just pass spending bills. And this was a real compromise and a concession on our part at the agreed upon, I call it the Failed Responsibility Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act from last summer, the debt ceiling agreement, which would cut some $100 billion over what they just did in the omnibus, by the way. Just go to that level. I mean, we're running a $200 billion deficit every month, so cutting $100 billion isn't very much. But go to that level and tell the Dems they don't get it unless they join us in securing the border. Attach border security to it, send it over to the Senate, then they get to choose whether or not to shut down the government or secure the border, and make the Democrats choose. And the American people would say, gosh, Speaker, you're fighting for us. You're trying. What a hero. And they would rally behind us, and we could win that shutdown fight because we're fighting over the border and very modest cuts to federal spending, which most Americans, I think, know is unsustainable. That said, there's not a lot between now and until September 30 on the horizon is the end of the 24 fiscal year when the government's got to be funded again. Or the government would shut down on October 1. And sadly and unfortunately, Brent, I think the best course of action, as much as I hate CRs, just like you do, I think we should do a 6-month CR that funds the government from October 1 to April 1 and kicks the can to hopefully a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and a Republican president, where the burden and responsibility will be on us and the opportunity to make meaningful change. What the Senate's going to try to do is force the Speaker, with fear of a shutdown, to fund the government for a whole year, fund it for the whole fiscal year, and that way we won't be able to impact it as a new Congress and a new White House next year. So that's the next fight, is going to be the spending appropriations process. I hope we're up for it.
I agree with you. I'm 100% behind you on this one. That's exactly what I think needs to be done. The issue is, will the base, will the grassroots trust the Republicans to do this? Or will they say, here you go again, you just kicked the can down the road another 6 months? I remember this, Bob, in 2012, there's a meeting, there's an organization called the Conservative Action Project. You know this, you've probably met with them before. And we were meeting, and a top conservative, I won't give his name, but a top well-respected conservative came to us, and he said, this was the summer of 2012, and he said, look, I want everybody to know the conservatives in the House and the Senate have agreed unanimously on a position we're going to take with the Obama administration with the upcoming CR, which was the last chance to do something about Obamacare before the elections. And we asked what it was. And the position, I'm not making this up, Bob. May something come out of the studio and get me if I am. The position the Republicans had, their opening position, was they were going to give the administration everything it wanted and not one penny more. I swear to God, that was the opening position.
That sounds familiar.
Well, so we asked for an emergency meeting with conservative leaders in the House and the Senate that evening, and I don't know, 40 of us met. I don't know how many it was, and Jim DeMint was tasked with giving the position that the conservatives had in the Hill, and I was tasked with giving the response that we had. Jim, speaking for all of them, not speaking for himself, speaking for everyone, said, here's the strategy. We are going to do this with the CR, we're going to ignore it. And then in November, we're going to hold the House and we're going to win the Senate. And the reason he said win the Senate was because all the polls showed that Republicans were guaranteed to pick up 6 seats. I think they needed 3 or something, to pick up 6 seats and maybe 2 more, guaranteed 6. We're going to pick up the Senate, and Mitt Romney is going to win the presidency. And then in January, we'll just undo everything. To which my response was, A, that's dishonest, because you should have said that to the American people. Otherwise, you're acting like a Democrat. Secondly, this is what's going to happen. You're going to do that CR. You may or you may not lose the House. You're definitely not going to pick up the Senate. and Mitt Romney is going to get crushed. And it's because Republicans are going to sit on their thumbs. In fact, that's exactly what happened in 2012. So that would happen again this time, unless they pick a fight. So I agree. So let me go to the final thing I want to talk to you about. The other issue where we may have disagreement, maybe not. Let me ask you first on Ukraine. Had it been done the way you proposed it to be done, tied to the border, would you have supported aid to Ukraine?
Well, we did try to compromise to that effect and try to give this the conservatives, the Freedom Caucus, we get a lot of unfair criticism. I mean, we signed up for this, but I just mean we get to, oh, you're against everything. You're just the no caucus. You're the chaos caucus. We always give the speaker alternatives, options, exit ramps, other strategies to pursue. And we went to him and said, listen, why not, instead of borrowing $60 billion for Ukraine, why don't we do $20 billion lethal only? Let's pay for it. Cut the IRS expansion, cut climate credits, cut the UN, cut the WHO, cut something to pay for it. Let's not borrow. We got to end the era of these supplementals where it's extra borrowing beyond the deficit we're running on a monthly basis with the budget that we already have. And let's attach border security to it. And so that they don't get the money, not even a border policy, but they don't get the money until the president takes the actions that will secure the border and bring the numbers down. And let's have a fight over Ukraine in exchange for border security. And let's skinny it down, lethal aid only. And those of us who don't support more aid for Ukraine, which I do not, we're willing to compromise and work with you on that. And he didn't want that strategy. He wanted $60 billion for Ukraine, just like the Democrats. He didn't want to tie it up in border security and then not get the Ukraine money. And he used Israel support to buy Ukraine votes from Republicans. He used the $9.5 billion for Hamas to buy Democrat votes for Israel, and Ukraine to buy Democrat votes for Israel. Put them all together in one package to send over to the Senate for $95 billion borrowed. And so, but to go specific on Ukraine, I just don't see how. I don't see what the end game is. I don't know what victory looks like. I don't know what the limit of U.S. involvement is. I don't know what the definition of our involvement is. Ukraine is not a democracy. They don't recognize what we think of as God-given liberties there of freedom of expression and freedom of the press and freedom of religion the way that we think it ought to be honored. I think Europe should be carrying the load, not the United States. They're not a NATO country for a reason. I think Russia has been weakened, exposed, emaciated, emasculated. I don't think Russia is a world power like in the 1930s with imperialist Japan or Nazi Germany that's about to take over Europe or the world. I think they've been weakened and exposed. Remember, we were told, Brent, that Ukraine would fall in 2 weeks. We were told by the so-called experts when this conflict first began, and yet they have fought admirably. And I want Ukraine to be victorious, whatever that looks like. But these are border countries that are going to be border countries for a long time. And so, do we really want to escalate that conflict and go to war with Russia over Ukraine? I'm not sure that we do. It certainly divides Americans. It certainly divides Republicans. It was only supported by 101 Republicans, and 112 Republicans voted against that portion of the package. And that really violates the majority rule, the Hastert rule, where you're not supposed to bring legislation to the floor as a Republican speaker that a majority of Republicans don't support. Democrats voted for their Ukraine money 210-0. I think it's the first time on a significant bill that the Democrats voted unanimously for it on a must-pass bill, while Republicans was about 45% who voted for it.
Well, I think, okay, but I think we need to separate the legislative means to the end and the end itself. Let me talk about the end itself, because this is something that I finally can't get my hands around. Why everybody supported Ukraine 1 year ago, and so many people have now just announced they don't. And absolutely nothing has changed from last year to this year. Let me explain it this way. There are four countries that border Russia: Finland, Norway, Estonia, Latvia. Two countries that border Ukraine: Slovakia and Poland. There's one country that doesn't border either one. It is Sweden. Now, those other countries all have two things in common. Number one, they all believe they're going to be invaded by Russia. They all believe that Putin has the dream of rebuilding the Soviet Empire the same way that Hitler had a dream of rebuilding Germany 20 years after World War I to where it was before. Every single one of them is not only rushing to NATO, they're members of, saying, NATO, you need to defend us, but Sweden, that isn't a part of NATO, isn't even on the border of Russia, has always been a reliable partner of the Soviet bloc. It is galloping to NATO, asking for support. Why? Because if you're a member of NATO, the United States is treaty bound to put troops on the ground, if necessary, to defend your country. So the argument that I believed in, and having been in Ukraine, I believe it as well. Having talked to the Poles, the Polish ambassador who says Ukraine is the front line of Poland, we see ourselves already in this struggle. Having seen that, I truly believe that if we don't support them correctly, and let's put it on the table, Ukraine is probably the most corrupt country in Europe. Let's put on the table they're not members of NATO, so they're not necessarily any great friends of ours. But I do believe if we don't support them and Putin wins and he does what everyone in Europe believes he's going to do, which is to move to expand, then suddenly you got a situation where the United States is treaty bound to go to war. And if that were to happen, then you can guess that immediately China will see the opportunity and go after Taiwan. Not to mention what North Korea will do, not to mention what's going to happen in the Middle East as a result. I see, and I don't want to be a scaremonger in this, but I really do see a possibility of a world war. This is how World War I started. It's just a little local conflict that blew into a world war. That's my position on that. Now, having said that, I also believe that Europe needs to do more. They'll come back, and I looked at some numbers. They've put in $156 billion, which is a lot of money. Only $36 billion is military aid. I looked into reliable countries like France. Once again, France has put in $3 billion. But my favorite, all-time favorite is Spain. Spain so far has, they've contributed 2 medical vehicles to the conflict, which is better than what they did in the first Iraq War, which was to contribute donkeys. So, you know, for those of you who say that Europe needs to do more, I'm with you completely. But that's my position on that. And I know there's disagreement on this, but I think we have to be very, very careful. But I also think that the country needs to know that you're not against lethal aid to Ukraine. There is that picture being drawn by the media that people like you are anti any support of Ukraine. I think it's important that story be told too. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot there. And I think that your view and the view of those who think we do need greater intervention, and some think we need to do whatever it takes to ensure that Ukraine prevails. I don't know how that happens. We're in about 175 billion, according to the reporting that I've gotten so far with this latest package. And I fear we're going to be back 6 months from now, and nothing's really changed, and they're going to be asking again. And the bottom line is, Brent, everything should be looked at through a fiscal lens to some degree. We don't have the money, and we're borrowing. We've also got our military in its own weakened, depleted state. I have reports from even in my district from bases that say, hey, their supplies of artillery and so forth has been shipped to Ukraine. They don't have it on their bases right now. We've got a commander-in-chief and an administration that doesn't understand what the purpose of our military is. They think it's to fight the climate war and to fight, you know, Christian nationalism or white supremacy or whatever in the military. They're focused on climate with the military. They're focused on transgender policies and LGBTQ and funding abortion and CRT and DEI. Our recruitment numbers are way down. Morale is way down. We kicked out patriots because they wouldn't get the COVID vaccine, as you know. So our military is in a weakened state. And I think that you're right in the sense that we should have done more to prevent this invasion, which I don't believe would have happened if Trump was still president, because he was a strong president and Putin and others feared him, and he would have kept them guessing about what we might have done. And what did this president do? He basically said, well, if you only take a little bit of Ukraine, it's okay. And he sent John Kerry over there to ask Putin to consider the climate implications of an invasion before he invaded, and obviously how weak we have projected ourselves on that stage. But I also think, and this is a larger, greater discussion than we probably have the scope to get in today, you look at NATO, as you've referenced it, and I think President Trump has been right to question this when you compare NATO, or even Europe, I should say, to the United States in terms of population, in terms of GDP, and in terms of wealth. Why should we be carrying Europe? When you also look at Europe, who's 20, 30 years ahead of us culturally in the wrong direction, further along, this is California on steroids, where we're trying to keep the country from going, you could make a case that why would the United States defend Europe to the death when Europe is standing against the things that you and I believe in as conservatives, by the way, and when they're not contributing to their own defense? You've got 30 NATO countries, a very small number of which are meeting their required 2% GDP. And we're a little bit like, you talked about the Ukraine-United States relationship, not a true ally. We're like the really rich guy who's got a lot of friends because people want what we have. And they're not really our friends. They just want what we have. And that's what happens around the world with these so-called allies. Even these NATO allies, some of these countries, Luxembourg or Montenegro or Iceland or whatever, they've got a few 100,000 people or a couple of million, and they've pledged, hey, United States, if you're attacked, we're going to go to war and defend you. And so we're on the hook to defend them, and we're not getting a whole lot from that. And you could argue that with the diminished state of Russia, it's not the Soviet Union, that it ought to be debated or considered what makes sense for us going forward. That said, I do believe, my friends who believe in greater U.S. involvement because of the threat of Russia and Putin's intentions and so forth, has merit to it. And I try to approach this issue, and frankly, for that matter, foreign policy issues, which are complex and unpredictable, and sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and you have these strange alliances, just like politics sometimes, because that's not my area of background and expertise. And certainly none of us want to see an elevated, stronger Russia, but I don't think Putin has been empowered or emboldened through this conflict. I think he's been weakened and exposed.
Okay, so Bob, we're going to leave it there. Congressman Bob Good, 5th District of Virginia, head of the House Freedom Caucus. You got a hell of a task in front of you, and we wish you well. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Brent. Great to be with you.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.